Have you ever stood by dark water and felt a sudden, irrational chill? A sense that you are being watched from below? Anna Kendrick would have dismissed it. She described herself as a card-carrying skeptic. UFOs, Bigfoot, lake monsters. What are we talking about, she'd say. Then came June of 2024, during a visit to Scotland's myth-soaked Loch Ness. The account describes a still surface. And then, something broke the water. It rose up, and in her words, it looked right at me. Her mind tried to explain it away as just one suspicious ripple, but the feeling was absolute. I'm telling you, she insists. There was something. I felt it. A modern skeptic's belief, fractured in a single moment at a world-famous loch. But this isn't a story about a distant myth. What if the same accounts of an ancient, watchful presence have been documented for centuries in the familiar waters of Minnesota? That feeling of being watched from the water, it is not new. And on a specific lake in Minnesota, that same unease has been passed down for centuries. Our account begins on Lake Pepin. The year is 1871. Two men, Giles Hay and C. Paige Bonnie, are paddling across its surface. But something is wrong. The air is heavy with a silence that doesn't belong. The original report describes it simply. The lake, usually full with the sounds of birds and the distant churning of steamboats, was just dead quiet. This unnatural stillness reminded them of a local protocol, one they had previously dismissed as superstition. The oral tradition of the Dakota people holds that a creature lived in these waters. They actively avoided the open lake, and when a crossing was unavoidable, they never used their light, swift birch bark canoes. Instead, they would only venture out in heavy, sturdy dugout canoes, hollowed from massive trees. Canoes strong enough, it was understood, to withstand an attack from below. Now, let's jump forward in time. 133 years, to be exact. It's 2004 on the very same lake. We meet Steve Raymond, a local gas station owner, a man with his feet planted firmly on the ground. The sun is out. You can hear traffic from the nearby town, the gentle lapping of waves against modern docks. To Steve, the old stories are just that. Stories. He openly scoffs at the local legend of a lake monster people have nicknamed Pepie. For him, it's just a clever marketing gimmick, a way for the local tourism bureau to sell merchandise and attract visitors. And in the bright light of a 21st century afternoon, his logic feels unshakable. An ancient, unspoken dread, held by people who lived with the water for generations. And a confident, modern dismissal from a man who lives by it today. For over a century, the two beliefs existed in parallel on Lake Pepin, but a body of water this old keeps its own counsel, and it was about to cast the deciding vote. For Steve Raymond, in 2004, the vote was cast on a perfectly ordinary afternoon. He was fishing. The sun was warm, the water calm. His boat drifted gently with the current. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a dead head, a waterlogged, partially submerged log. Common enough. But something was wrong. His boat was drifting south. The log was moving north, upstream, against the current. Steve watched it for a moment, a small smile playing on his lips. He knew about the local legend, of course. Pepie, the town's monster mascot. He even knew about the $50,000 reward offered for a credible photo. He figured, why not? Might as well motor over, snap a picture, and have a good story about the log that looked like a monster. He reached for his keys. Cut back to 1871. For Hay and Bonnie, in their heavy Dakota canoe, there was no thought of rewards, only a growing sense of unease. Then a sound. The accounts describe it as being like a rushing wind, but the air around them was perfectly still. Not a leaf stirred on the shore. Then they saw it on the water, a massive V-shaped wave of white, churning water, moving towards them. It too was moving against the current. But unlike Steve's log, this thing was moving at what the Wabasha County Sentinel would later call great speed. In both moments, separated by over a century, the human mind did what it always does. It tried to find a rational box to put the experience in. In 1871, Hay and Bonnie's thoughts raced. A school of sturgeon? No, this was a single unified wave. A line of gas bubbles erupting from the lake bed? Maybe. But their minds recoiled from the thought. Gas bubbles don't move in a perfectly straight line at 20 miles an hour. It simply wasn't possible. And in 2004, as Steve Raymond's boat got closer, his casual amusement began to drain away. The object was still moving upstream, steady, unwavering. It wasn't drifting. It was traveling. Both sets of witnesses, in their own time, were now caught. They were no longer just looking at something strange in the water. They were staring at something that broke the laws of water itself. Something that shouldn't exist. But it did. And it was getting closer. In 2004, instinct took over. Steve Raymond raised the camera to his eye, the cool plastic a familiar comfort against the rising unease. The object was steady in the frame. He pressed the zoom. The image jumped, stabilized. He was looking for evidence of a hoax. Wires? A motor. Something. He zoomed again. The image filled the viewfinder, wobbling slightly with the motion of his own boat. His breath caught in his throat. The surface wasn't wood. Wood has grain, texture, the familiar pattern of bark. This was different. The account he later gave described a molted greenish color. Through his lens he saw it was slick, shiny, like the wet skin of some colossal amphibian. Cut to 1871. There's only the sound of desperate splintering wood against water and the frantic gasps of Hay and Bonnie. The huge, dark object no longer followed. It hunted. It closed the distance with a speed that churned the calm lake into a frenzy. The V-shaped wake, once a curiosity, was now a wall of water bearing down on their tiny Dakota canoe, a predator's jaw about to snap shut. Back in 2004, Steve's world had gone silent. The gentle lapping of the lake, the cry of a distant bird, all of it vanished. All that existed was the image in his camera. He saw what looked like knots on the log. But as his focus sharpened, he saw they weren't knots. They were ridges. The report would later say, ridges like the spine of an animal. His mind was screaming, log. His eyes were seizing, monster. And then, the impossible happened. The entire 60-foot length of the object bent. It flexed in the middle, a slow, deliberate, impossibly organic motion. The knots on its back rippled in perfect, horrifying sequence down its length. The illusion did not just crack. It was annihilated in a single, fluid movement. The concept of log was erased and replaced by a reality so terrifying, his hands froze on the camera. This was not an object. This was an animal. A living thing of incomprehensible size, and he was floating right beside it. In 1871, the front of the canoe was lifted violently out of the water. Hay and Bonnie were thrown against the stern, the sky and water swapping places in a disorienting blur. The wake was no longer behind them. It was under them. It was on top of them. The dark, churning water began to pour over the side. The cold lake water poured over the side of the canoe. For Giles Hay and C. Paige Bonnie, this was the end. Exhausted, their arms burning, they had nowhere left to run. They stopped paddling and waited for the inevitable, but the attack never came. Instead, the water beside them began to swell upwards. A vast body of flesh rose silently from the depths. The 1871 newspaper account, quoting the men, tried to capture the scale. They described its size as being between that of an elephant and a rhinoceros combined. The sheer displacement of its mass created a wave that lifted their boat one last time, nearly capsizing it. It passed them with a kind of majestic indifference. It wasn't a monster hunting them. It was a force of nature, moving through its domain. And then, as silently as it appeared, it sank back into the deep. Hay and Bonnie were left floating, soaked, shaking, and alive. The Dakota's superstition was no longer a story. It was a memory, etched into the cold silence of the lake. A close call, but ultimately, a story of survival, of witnessing something magnificent. But this account, it omits the single most terrifying detail. A detail that wouldn't be understood for another 133 years. You see, it isn't the size of the creature that truly breaks a person's mind. It's the moment it turns and decides to look at you. We cut to 2004. Steve Raymond sits in his boat, the water placid. And then, it happens. A long, serpentine head and neck rise from the water. The witness accounts described it as almost like a snake. There's no roar, no churning water, no display of aggression at all. It simply turns its head, and it looks directly at him. In that moment of eye contact, Steve felt something that chilled him far more than any physical threat. He felt a terrifying, undeniable sense of intelligence, a sense of recognition. This was not a mindless beast. It was aware. It saw him. It knew he was there. As silently as it appeared, it slipped back beneath the surface. Gone. The water settled. The world was quiet again. But everything had changed. Steve Raymond slowly lowered his camera. His hands, once steady, were not anymore. He didn't check the footage. He didn't glance back at the spot where it had vanished. He simply started his engine and quietly motored away from the shore, abandoning any thought of the $50,000 reward. He had arrived a skeptic, hoping to capture a monster. He left as a secret keeper. These stories, of Hay and Bonnie, of Steve Raymond, are stories of observation. They are about what happens when humanity accidentally crosses paths with a guardian of the deep and chooses respect. But what happens when someone doesn't just observe? What happens when someone decides to hunt a guardian? That is an entirely different kind of story. To understand that prophecy, to understand the debt that was incurred on that island, we must go back. Back to the moment before the sky broke. Back to the original sin. The date is May 3rd, 1782. The place, a remote sliver of land in Lake Superior known as Pie Island. The last light of day is draining from the sky, leaving behind the deep indigo of a northern dusk. By a crackling fire sits Venant St. Germaine, a French-Canadian fur trader. He is a man of his era, pragmatic, brave, shaped by a worldview that sees the wilderness not as a home, but as a frontier to be conquered and catalogued. With him is his elderly Ojibwe companion. For him, the lake is a resource, a challenge. He respected the lake because it could kill him. She respected the lake because she believed it was alive. Saint Germain walks to the water's edge, the lake's surface as smooth and dark as obsidian. And that is when he sees it. The official deposition he would later give swears to the details. It was, he said, the size of a child of 7 or 8 years old. Its skin seemed to catch the firelight with a strange shimmer. But it was the eyes that held him. They were, in his words, shining eyes, intelligent, aware. Then the account describes how the creature slowly raised one of its arms toward him, an arm that ended in something that looked unnervingly like a human hand. In that moment, Saint Germain felt no fear. He felt an impulse far older, far more dangerous: possession. He didn't see a life form. He saw a trophy, a one-of-a-kind specimen that would make his name legend. He turns from the shore, his movements cold and efficient. He grabs his musket. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back is a sound of sacrilege in the evening's quiet. He raises the barrel, taking aim at the small, watching figure in the water. But just as his finger tightens on the trigger, a blur of motion explodes from the fireside. His Ojibwe companion, who had been watching in silent horror, lunges at him. She throws her entire weight against him, a desperate, physical rejection of his reality. Her hands shove his arms, knocking the gun aside. The musket fires, its deafening roar tearing through the peace, the shot going wide and harmlessly into the vast emptiness of the lake. Saint Germaine sprawls on the ground, a cry of fury and confusion on his lips. He looks from the empty water back to the woman now standing over him. She is breathless, her body trembling, her hand pointing not at him, but at the dark water. A gesture not of accusation, but of terrified reverence. The gun was lowered. The creature was gone. But as he looked into his companion's eyes, Saint Germaine did not see relief. He saw a deeper fear, the fear of a debt that had just been signed, witnessed by the ancient, silent water, and the price had yet to be named. On the shore, the Ojibwe woman did not flinch. She simply turned to Saint Germaine, and in the quiet cadence of her own language, delivered the verdict. He had trespassed. He had angered the Manitou, the great spirit of the water, Mishipeshu, and a terrible price would be paid. Saint Germaine, a man of the Enlightenment, a man of ledgers and logic, barely understood her words, but understood her tone perfectly. He dismissed it as primitive fear. He looked out. The lake was a sheet of glass. The sky above was a flawless, empty blue. He gave a curt nod, his mind already on the value of the furs, not the superstitions of the locals. That night, his rational world was shattered. From that same clear sky, a gale-force storm erupted. It did not roll in from the horizon. It simply appeared. It slammed into their specific island with unnatural precision. The sound, as Saint Germaine would later depose, was not of wind, but of the screaming of 1,000 beasts. The calm lake was whipped into a frenzy of towering, violent waves, jaws of black water that snapped at the edges of their camp, claws that scraped away the shoreline foot by foot. For 3 full days the storm raged, 72 hours, and it felt intelligent. It felt personal. Beyond their little island of terror, the sky remained clear, a silent, mocking witness to their torment. Saint Germaine's annoyance on the first day curdled into a cold dread on the second. He saw the waves shift, the wind change direction, as if hunting them when they tried to move their shelter. By the third day, the man of reason was gone. In his place was a huddled animal, broken, listening to the screams on the wind, and finally understanding. The woman's warning was not a superstition. It was a prophecy. 30 years passed. Time can weather stone and dull the sharpest memories, but it could not erase the mark left on Venant St. Germaine. It is now 1812. The man who huddled in terror on Pie Island is gone. In his place is a wealthy, respected merchant in Montreal, a figure of standing in his community. But the memory of the intelligent storm, of the presence in the water, has followed him through 3 decades of prosperity. He decides it cannot remain a ghost story, a private terror. It must become part of the official record. In November of 1812, the historical accounts confirm he gave a sworn, legal deposition. He recounted every detail: the creature in the deep, the raising of his musket, and the personal 3-day tempest that followed. This is the anchor of the entire story. It is not folklore. It is the legal testimony of a respected citizen, a debt of truth finally put on paper, preserved in the archives for all time. Now, we let another 9 years pass. The year is 1821. 39 years after he raised his musket on the lake. So, Germaine is in a room with friends. The atmosphere is leisurely, comfortable. A lifetime has passed. One of his friends, in a moment of casual jest, picks up a musket from the wall. One that everyone in the room believes is unloaded. He points it, laughing, at Saint Germaine. A joke between friends. The musket fires. A flash of powder, a cloud of smoke, and the impossible sound of a shot in the quiet room. Saint Germaine is struck in the chest. As he falls, his horrified friend rushing to his side. The records describe the look on Saint Germaine's face. There is no anger, no shock, only a chilling, quiet acceptance, as if he had been waiting for this very moment for 39 years. He looks at the man who has just killed him and says, simply, "You have killed me." The prophecy was fulfilled. The debt, set in motion by a raised musket nearly 4 decades prior, was finally paid by another. Paid in iron. But Saint Germain's story, as chilling and complete as it is not an isolated event. It's a single, stark data point in a much larger, more disturbing pattern. These accounts, from the colonial trader in 1782 to the modern witnesses of our own time, are not just campfire tales. The accounts describe coordinates, mapping the boundaries of something ancient. And what happens when you connect all the dots? What is the final, terrifying picture they reveal? The final picture is not of a monster, it is of a boundary. A living one. When you connect the coordinates from these accounts, spanning centuries, they don't map the territory of a creature. They map the edges of a sovereign space. This reframes the entire phenomenon. We have been looking for a beast, when the evidence has always pointed toward an intelligence that enforces rules. What ethnobiologists now understand is that these belief systems, like the Ojibwe reverence for Mishipeshu, were not primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated cultural mechanisms for resource management. The dread of the guardian's wrath enforced very real taboos. Taboos against taking too much copper from the sacred isles. Taboos against overfishing the waters. It was a framework where respect was the currency of survival, and the consequences for disrespect were immediate and severe. A sudden storm, a capsized boat, a disappearing fish stock. This ancient wisdom has not vanished. It persists, evolving in the present day. Contemporary Ojibwe artists and activists are reinterpreting Mishipeshu, transforming the guardian from a figure of passive reverence into a potent symbol for water rights, environmental justice, and climate resilience. The guardian's role as a protector of boundaries is more relevant now than ever. So that intuition, the deep-seated feeling that the depths remember, is not just a source of fear. It is the echo of a forgotten contract, a framework for respect. The guardians, whether of lake or of forest, are evolving in our understanding, from figures of folklore into vital symbols for our own active stewardship in a world that has forgotten its boundaries. These accounts span hundreds of years, but they all echo the same warning. Have you ever been on a lake or deep in the woods and had that sudden, unexplainable feeling that the place itself was watching you? Share your story in the comments. And if you feel a connection to these deeper mysteries, like the video and subscribe for more explorations into the unknown.